So we were discussing, in order to arrive at the question of social contract, as to how the question of freedom, liberty, the question of right, and finally the question of morality, all of them they form an intricate sort of ornament or a wire in order to enable, arm Rousseau to arrive at his supreme procedure called the social contract. Now we were talking about morality and freedom and question of deception, which arrives after we have exited the state of nature. This is how Rousseau actually formulates the whole scene. But the question of deception, the question of morality, is very problematic for Rousseau, and this we shall actually find crucial in discussing political thought, which cannot formulate the everyday political happenings in their pure form. For instance, Rousseau talks about the self-deception that takes place when one goes to see a theatre, right? There, a tragic scene is witnessed and enjoyed by someone in the audience. He or she sort of cries, identifies with the character, the tragic character cries. And then when he or she comes out of the theatre, he is as cruel, as unjust, in fact as anti-tragic as one could be. This self-deception, this question of morality for Rousseau then is somewhat problematic. Similarly, the question of conscience. You'll remember we discussed the question of conscience in Locke. You remember inner conscience, right? Now, as I said, for Rousseau, the will becomes political. The conscience becomes, in a sense, political conscience. Because here, the conscience is something which, helps you to make a distinction between the just and the unjust. Conscience is not something very religious and which is a matter of the, inner soul. Finally, when he discusses freedom, Rousseau makes a curious distinction that we have to take into account. He makes a, three-tier distinction of freedom. Natural freedom, which men used to enjoy when they were in a state of nature. When they usher in a state of society, it is kind of a civil freedom. Freedom which is enjoyed by the citizens, right? And finally, it's a question of moral freedom. Now, this question of moral freedom is the benchmark or the breaking point from where Rousseau takes a leap and arrives at his social contract. Today we understand political freedom in terms of if we want to participate in political affairs, we have to have, voting rights. We want to stand as a representative, political representative. We want to hold a political office and disburse political affairs, right? This we understand as political freedom. But Rousseau is not really using the term political freedom. He's using the term moral freedom. What does he, mean by this? The clear and the basic premise has to be made clear. Now, in medieval political thought or medieval, society, whatever, it is not a modern society because it is a society not based on freedom or rights. People were a constituted part of the community. A single soul. There was nothing called an individual. Everything was a community, right? So in a community, in a medieval community, right? You don't have a separate right. You don't have an individual right. Whatever sort of the society, the social community tells you to do, prescribes for you to do, what is customary in fact. an individual is forced to undertake that thing. For instance, the classical example would be, for instance, a caste society. A caste society is a prescribed society. You don't have freedom to choose your occupation. You don't have any freedom to choose your rituals, to choose marriage, to choose your partner, right? To choose offices for your children, or to go for higher posts or higher education, whatever. A caste society is absolutely a society in which, right, the prescribed rules, the prescription is so much. There is no self-prescription, right? This is, in fact, modern society, as it is grossly called, is a departure from this prescribed society, where you don't have only duties but also have rights. It is not that the collective, all other people, they decide for you, right? So this kind of freedom, which is possible in a modern society, which is a society made up of even individual rights, group rights, right, also community rights, is a society where freedom has a moral significance. A moral significance means, moral significance, we had discussed this when we were talking about slavery. Slavery is immoral because it is not only without freedom, but by abolishing freedom, it becomes immoral. So moral freedom, apparently it would seem empty, but no, it is very significant. Moral freedom is a kind of freedom which, even if I want to give away, it stays with me. Right? A moral freedom is freedom in which the question of self, the question of myself, the question of yourself, his or herself, remains absolutely intact. Because, as you know, modernity or the modern society, apart from freedom and right, because freedom and right of whose? It is a question of the self. When in a caste society, the question of the self remains secondary, right? You cannot say, I am myself, right? No, not necessarily. I am what my religion or my community decides for myself, right? But what happens when you decide, along with the community, right? Everybody decides for the community, everybody agrees with the laws, they set up the laws for themselves, right? Then the freedom that is it's not lost. The freedom rather is kept in suspension. The freedom rather is divided among all of us. That is moral freedom. So with this question, Rousseau arrives at his, social contract. Rousseau's beginning of the social contract is by hatching an image where people come together in order to overcome resistance. And then, say for instance, they come together, they discuss, right? That let us have these laws, let us have these rules, okay? Now, while discussing this, for instance, if you want to form a club, as we were discussing in the last lecture, so we discuss, for instance, I want to play carom, when we can, go for a picnic on Monday, right? Now, everybody they decide that, well, now it might be the case that I might, prefer a picnic on Sunday, not Monday, okay? Now, it might be very possible that I might have to adjust my day for a picnic, right? And then when I feel that it is to my own self-interest or convenience, somebody else will have a problem. But then we could aggregate our own interests and wishes, and then we can generate a common program, a common will. This is the general will. Okay? So, with this image, the kind of self-aggregation happens. People come together, right? In order to through the force of the general will, they come to a contract. In fact, it is necessary that I quote from, Rousseau himself. What does he say on this? I quote, "The problem is to find a form of association which will defend and protect with a whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone, and remain as free as before. this is the fundamental problem of which the social contract provides the solution. Now, look at his words. I mean, while uniting himself with all, I still obey myself alone and remain as free as before. I mean, a lot of objections have been raised as to what is this elusive general will of Rousseau and what is the social contract. Rousseau has a solution to this. When Rousseau was discussing, slavery and Grotius, he made a point. Grotius says that the people, give themselves to the king as a gift, as a kind of offering, as slaves or blind subjects, whatever. But he also says that the people are constituted before the king. I mean, if there are no people, where will the king arise from? The king will come from the people, obviously. I mean, if there is a king and there are no people, no subjects, right? Then he is not a sovereign at all. If the king has to be an absolute sovereign, there should be people. I mean, the king obviously comes from within the people. So the people is constituted before the king. The people come first and then the king. Rousseau says, what we have to discuss, basically, this is our problem. This is today's problem. The problem of modern political thought is how does the people, constitute themselves? The people constituting themselves, right? One cannot say when does it happen. Does it come before? It comes, the general will comes at the same time when the people constitute themselves. The general will is there. The question of deliberation, I mean, say for instance, as we are, deploying an example of the formation of a club. People come together, discuss. The deliberation is of course there. I mean, Rousseau talks about deliberation. People, they have their own, scarcity. They have their own problems, which they will themselves solve through deliberation, where the political representatives might play a facilitator role. The role of a facilitator, not more than that, right? He is not supposed to represent them, in a sense. So, when we say that the people come together as if in a Greek assembly, and then they deliberate, discuss, and find their own problems, right? Now, here, a good example would be if an aggregate of people, say for instance, the whole assembly, you cannot have the whole community coming together because we have a mass, big society, big democracy where you cannot have all the people coming together, right? So, if a community, local community, a neighborhood comes together, then all have their problems. But there will be still problems which are common to all of them. Okay? Now, I have a very singular, unique problem, for instance. I'll put that aside. We'll look for a common problem, which is common to all, which are common problems which are common to all, right? That is the general will. That is, in fact, the general will the problems of will, no. The general will helps you to discover that which is general, which is common to all, which is a kind of, say, a municipal or a divine or a citizen's average. Okay? How does that happen? Rousseau says that happens when we sort of, transcend, when we go above our own self-interest and try to occupy the shoes of others. You remember we talked about compassion and all kinds of... This is not mere pity, but it's a kind of operational, sort of instrument by which, or a behavior, by which we occupy the shoes of others, they occupy our shoes, and something common is discovered. Okay? Now, to understand this, it should be clear by now. Okay? Now, the problem is, and the crucial question is, by this social contract, we give a bit of freedom. We lose, of course, lose freedom, our bit of freedom. But to whom? We lose them to the community. The community as if keeps our, sort of rights and freedom in a safe box, right? We have not lost it because we are the community. And then, because we have our freedom and we have our rights intact, it is we who are the sovereign. For Rousseau, this is very different from Locke or Hobbes. Who is the sovereign? The king? The despot? The sovereign who is above? No. The sovereign, people, is the sovereign. The community is the sovereign. And this is why Rousseau is often identified with what you call the communitarian strand of thinking. He is not a theorist of the private individual or private person, but he is a theorist of, all of us, as if. So we are the ruler. We rule ourselves. By ruling ourselves, of course, we have to subject to some decisions. But those decisions are ours. So it's a kind of circular procedure by which everybody rules everybody else, right? Now, the question of, the general will or the social contract reaches a benchmark when Rousseau talks about a common interest, which is, common to all of us. By which, what Rousseau says, a republic is found. This association which is formed by an aggregate of people, it is what Rousseau calls very significant. If we are private persons, you are a private person, I am a private person. But the association which is formed by the, force of the general will is a public person. And here is the quotation, the second quotation, which is important. Each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and in our corporate capacity we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. Just notice that there are three strands here. Three strands. One is, of course, when he tries to demarcate and he tries to sort of put general will under the rubric of, say, for instance, three levels of the will. One is, for instance, we have our self-interest, each of us. One, when we transcend, when we go above our self-interest and occupy others' shoes, right? That's a kind of, one might say, public interest or common interest, a collective interest, collective. Last is corporate capacity or corporate will, when there's a subset of a population which also has a will. Now, this is, to mark just shortly or briefly, this comes from, basically medieval political and legal thought. When we could link this to, Locke and Hobbes. For instance, church or a firm today, we have corporations also. They are supposed to have personalities of their own. This is very significant. They are artificial persons. Artificial person, you remember, even Hobbes talked about it, right? So, but we could transpose this problem. Where, will, a general will, how could it become the will of, a corporate body? Or the question of the example of the club that we were, furnishing is enough to understand this. A body, a corporate body or a collective body has a group personality in the sense that when, for instance, we have a club. Now, this club, for instance, stands for altruistic activities, charity, social welfare activities. We go for medical camps, we help the disabled. Now, all these activities will make up the personality of the club. There will be rules and bylaws. Fine. Now, the question is whether this personality of the club is different from our personality. No, because once we have subscribed to become the members, voluntary members of this association or the club, then our personality, our will, our desire is also reflected in the activities, in the rules and bylaws of the association. But a point should be noted also. In the question of firms or corporation, clubs or business houses, church, temples or mosques, whatever. They have their own personalities. It is not rejected by the question of general will or social contract of Rousseau. But the model of that kind of, personality, when a club has a personality or a group has a personality, and it reflects my personality, though still I stand in a sense also apart. My personality could be there will be activities which will be very different. I could undertake those activities very differently. In other occasions, not all my activities are club activities. Okay? Not all, a businessman, for example, he's not always a businessman. Right? So, but the essence of those corporations, firms or clubs is the point which Rousseau is trying to make. Right? The moment a business house or a firm, a football club or a corporation, the question of the personality is projected. The question of the group personality is projected. It is, based on the notion of moral freedom, on the question of social contract, the question of the general will, right? Where the individual will of the private person and the collective will of the associational body, they meet together and they work as one. It is, of course, very problematic in the sense you'll find later that this theory, this formulation of Rousseau, that I give laws unto myself, I form an association where we, as a collective body, where I am free by sort of, participating in that freedom. This has seemed very, complex for a generation of people to come till Immanuel Kant, a philosopher named Immanuel Kant, arrived in the scene. And, the whole philosophy after Kant, which still, it rings true and it is working havoc in all quarters of philosophy, continental or Anglo-American, whatever. This self-constitution, this kind of law, when, for instance, when you, work in a team, when I say, often we say, teamwork or team game. The moment you imagine how a team works, right, then you'll understand what a general or what a collective will is, or what a social contract in its minimal form would be. Now, after the question of the public person, as we said, this association could be called, as Rousseau said, a public person. This is very different from the private person as we, I, you, he or she could be. So, but still, a public person is a person collectively called, right? Now, having completed social contract and general will in some modular form, what is Rousseau's conclusion here? Now, as we said, Rousseau is invoking the question of legitimacy. How governance, how sovereignty could be legitimate? Now, what is sovereignty as we know? Sovereignty is the power, for instance, to, decide. Sovereignty is the power to decide. Okay? Now, who is the sovereign who decides? Right? Sovereignty could be extended over a territory, over a length of time. That is a point which is not very relevant here. But Rousseau's point is that sovereignty becomes legitimate here. That we rule ourselves, through these procedure of general will and by forming a collective association, right? And the instrument of social contract happening. Sovereignty becomes legitimate. In Rousseau's language, this is the new convention that takes place, right? That people were before the king had arrived. According to Rousseau, this is a convention. He uses often the word convention. He goes on repeating that, hammers on the word convention. He says whether there are no standard rules, where there is no standard historical discovery procedure. You don't know when the first king had arrived. There might be no historical instance. We have to look at the conventions, or in a sense customs, right? So this is the new convention that Rousseau lays bare. Now, why Rousseau thinks sovereignty becomes legitimate? Sovereignty in the sense the power to govern, the power to decide. And the community governs itself. We govern ourselves. We the people. Remember in India, for instance, we the people. That means the people constitutes themselves. Now the self-constitution of the people becomes legitimate through this convention of social contract, operated, found, constituted by the general will. Because this is legitimate because it is based on, social contract, one. And secondly, because it is equitable. Now this is a new term. Equitable means this is just and right for all. Right? If we sort of, have a cake and divide that equally among all of us, right? Then the mode of the distribution is called equitable distribution. It's not always that 1.5 will be, for each. But according to needs or whatever, the distribution will be fair. Okay? Now, this is Rousseau's main point when he concludes the question of social contract and general will, is that it makes sovereignty legitimate because it is based on a legitimate convention of social contract, and secondly, it is an equitable procedure which is just for all. Just means it is fair to all, and fair to all means that the benefits and burden, the advantages and disadvantages are shared and carried out by all without blaming each other.